Hi, I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am thrilled to be joined by Richard Bush, my old friend, who recently, he tells me, retired from Brookings, but is now the non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Center for East Asian Policy. He was at Brookings, boy, as far back as I can remember, I think since certainly for longer than I've been at the National Committee, which started in 2005, but I think he joined in 2002 after he had been chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan, AIT, and before that on the National Intelligence Council and working on the Hill. But I have over these many years always looked to Richard as kind of the same view of what we should have on our relationship with Taiwan and on cross-strait relations. Today's program is based upon his writing this incredibly timely book. He's obviously written extensively on U.S.-Taiwan relations, Taiwan and cross-strait relations, but less than a couple of months ago, he came out with a book called Difficult Choices. For those of you like me who have spent a lot of time both living on Taiwan and dealing with the Taiwan government, this is a welcome book because there's a ton written on Taiwan that gives a lot of heat and little light. And this book gives tons of light. So let me start with my first question, and the timing of it is spectacular.
Thank you.
Why this book? Why now? And tell us what the title, Difficult Choices, refers to.
First of all, a few years ago, I became increasingly worried about the performance of the Taiwan political system. Taiwan gets a lot of respect internationally and from the United States for its democratic system, for its peaceful transition to democracy, and for at least some of its democratic institutions. But Taiwan also faces a lot of challenges. And the question I wanted to explore in this book is the democratic system up to the job? You know, the inputs of the system, they're pretty good, but what about the outputs of the system? And so I decided to sort of address that in this book. Cross-strait relations enters into it because China's a key issue for Taiwan. There is a sense in which this book brings me full circle in my career, because when I worked on Capitol Hill, I worked for the late Congressman Stephen Solars, who was one of the smartest people I've ever known. One of his goals was to encourage Taiwan to make a transition to democracy. And we made a small contribution to that. The main effort was done on Taiwan itself. And this was quite a phenomenon at the time. This was a Chinese society moving from an authoritarian system to a democratic one, making that transition peacefully and gradually. And it brought hope that if it could happen in Taiwan, it could happen elsewhere. Things didn't work out exactly as people hoped. There were some bumps along the way. Taiwan has some good leaders. It doesn't always have good followers, but this was my effort to make an assessment of Taiwan's democratic system some 30 years after it began.
Difficult Choices refers to the choices of the Taiwan system as opposed to the United States.
Yes, sorry, I missed your last question. The political system is all about making choices. And sometimes the choices are easy, sometimes they are hard. In the case of Taiwan, I think the choices are getting more and more difficult, partly because the problems are not easy, not so easy to solve. On the one hand, Taiwan is not the sort of fast-growing economy that it once was. Growth has slowed down. Taiwan's companies face a lot of competition from companies on the Chinese mainland and other places. At the same time, it's an aging society. And you have every day, there are more elderly people depending on a declining number of young people to care for them. How Taiwan remains competitive in the years ahead and how it is able to create growth and equality at the same time, that's a tough one. We're facing the same kind of difficulty.
Exactly what I was going to say. It's every democratic society, as the book lays out, faces a lot of these same challenges. The difference is, on top of all the challenges which you point out, and then you point out that it has the challenge of obviously the relationship with the mainland.
Yes.
What would, you dedicate the book to both of our old friends, who passed away, Alan Romberg. What would Alan say about the book?
I learned never to put words in Alan's mouth.
But you can do it now. He's left.
But I think that he would be very pleased with my effort to drill down on the realities of Taiwan's democratic system and to try to explain for an outside audience how hard it is for a place like Taiwan in its situation to come up with good policies. I think he would also approve of the message that I am trying to convey to people in Taiwan, and that is that the problems they face are not easy. The challenges, particularly from China, are really hard. The stakes are high. And so Taiwan's leaders and politicians can't afford to get this wrong. 23 million people are depending on them to do a good job. And I hope that message gets across.
Talk just briefly. A lot of people don't understand the American Institute in Taiwan and don't understand how it functions. And then put it in the context of when you became chair, Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui had just visited the United States, and it was a time of actually heightened tension between the US and China as a result of that, and between Taiwan and the mainland.
The American Institute in Taiwan is, I like to say, the mechanism through which the US government conducts its unofficial relationship with the island of Taiwan. We do not have official relations with Taiwan. We don't have diplomatic relations, but we have a lot of common interests. We sometimes have problems, and we need the same sort of institutional capacity to be able to deal with them on a range of issues. My time as chairman was particularly interesting because it was in the aftermath of Lee Teng-hui's visit to the United States. Politics in Taiwan was becoming much more lively, and Taiwanese nationalism was a greater factor. And Beijing was becoming more concerned that Taiwan nationalism was going to lead to a demand for a Taiwan state, for Taiwan independence, which was, they felt, a reason to go to war. And US officials at that time, both in the Clinton administration and then the George W. Bush administration, were quite concerned about the direction that Taiwan politics was taking Taiwan. One of the aspects of my time as AIT chairman, of which I was most pleased, was managing the transition from Kuomintang-controlled government to a Democratic Progressive Party government in as a result of the 2000 presidential election in Taiwan. And we didn't know at the time I became AIT chairman that the DPP was going to win and create a whole set of uncertainties, but we knew it was a possibility. So we started then to prepare the ground for being able to work as well as we could with a DPP government. I made it possible for Chen Shui-bian, who was going to be the DPP candidate, to come twice to Washington to meet face to face with U.S. officials. I had him and his team have dinner at my house on one of those trips. And for the first couple of years, it worked out well. And then Mr. Chen moved off in a different direction. But
and China did not, because he was not a sitting official. There was no objection from the Chinese.
There was no objection that I recall. I think China by that time had realized that it was important for U.S. officials at a fairly senior level to have quiet dialogue channels with Taiwan leaders so that we could encourage Taiwan in a constructive direction and dissuade it from a provocative direction. It didn't always work, but those sorts of contacts, I think they realized, were actually in China's interests.
AIT, talk a little bit about AIT. It's obviously, we don't call it an embassy. What does it not do that an embassy does? Except be called an embassy and the head of it be called an ambassador. Except for that.
Except for that, the day-to-day working of the relationship in Taipei is very much like the sort of relations that would occur between an American embassy overseas and its host government. So our officials meet with Taiwan officials in their offices all the way up to the president.
Except they're not officials. Ours are not officials by name, right?
Ours are not official by name. We don't have diplomatic relations.
Right. So they're seconded to the AIT.
Yes, because AIT is sort of legally a private organization, we can say that these are unofficial relations.
Right.
There has been an evolution of the way our diplomats, our officials, and Taiwan representatives in the United States interact. And as our relations have become broader and deeper, the need to evolve how we conduct those relations has evolved as well. But we do not recognize the government in Taipei as a government for purposes of diplomatic relations. We don't take a position on whether Taiwan's a part of China. We recognize the government in Beijing as the sole legal government of China. And so there are restraints. But
how does it affect the day-to-day operation? But for the name, isn't the day-to-day operation the same as if it were an embassy?
Since I'm no longer an official, I can honestly say from the inside, it operates like an embassy.
Yeah, yeah.
We are hardwired into...
Should we kind of, it does operate. I mean, I've dealt with, when you were head of AIT, I was building a business of over 1,000 employees in Taiwan and had lots of dealings with the folks on the ground in Taipei, and it functioned no different from when I was in, Singapore or Malaysia or Indonesia or elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they had the commercial counselor if there were issues relating to, whether a foreign company, whether an American company was being treated fairly. It was functionally the same. So the question, which I've never fully understood, is why didn't, why don't we use that for kind of the basis of some form of cross-strait relations? That, you acknowledge some principle, and in practice, you kind of do what you do if it were two governments. Isn't the theory kind of AIT one, which of course comes from the Japan example? When we created AIT, it was to some degree based upon how the Japanese established diplomatic relations and the unofficial relationship that continued. And we went one step further. But should we have used that more and kind of pushing towards some cross-strait relationship that allowed Taiwan to continue what it's doing, and yet some kind of acknowledgement of something slightly more, or the 92 consensus, that we should have more of a position on that?
It's a good question. When your good friend Ma Ying-jeou was president of Taiwan from 2008 to 2016, there was a warming of relations between the two sides of the strait. The government in Beijing had confidence in President Ma's intentions and confidence in his desire to broaden and deepen cross-strait relations. And as you also know, Ma Ying-jeou was working at the Mainland Affairs Council at the time that the Straits Exchange Foundation on the Taiwan side was set up to conduct cross-strait relations on behalf of the Taiwan government. Beijing set up the Association for Relations across the Taiwan Strait to serve the same role. These were AIT-like organizations. They were called the White Glove Organization. So the framework already existed. There were no illusions that these were actually private organizations. They were working on behalf of their governments. And during President Ma's presidency, there was exploration of the idea of having the Straits Exchange Foundation set up a branch office in Beijing, and the Association for Relations across the Taiwan Strait to set up a branch office in Taipei, just the way the United States deals with Taiwan. Because there was something of a deterioration in cross-strait relations toward the end of President Ma's time in office, that didn't happen. But it would have facilitated better communications between the two sides, because you would have had Taiwan officials in Beijing being able to do business all the time, vice versa in Taipei.
Yeah, in fact, the book deals in great, and I learned a ton from reading it about, number one, it talks about polling data on the 92 consensus, which I found absolutely fascinating, but it also talks about, when Tsai Ing-wen became president, the PRC decision to reject her kind of what I would call semi-embrace of the 92 consensus. Talk about that, and you kind of conclude that even if she had accepted it, you kind of don't quite think cross-strait relations would have gone in the right direction anyhow. Talk a bit about that. And then I urge everybody to read the book, because we won't have time to go into all the detail.
When Tsai Ing-wen understood that she was going to be the DPP's candidate in the 2016 presidential elections, this was about 2014, she knew that she had to reassure the Taiwan public that she wasn't going to do anything radical or provocative. But more importantly, she had to reassure the government in Beijing that she wasn't going to do anything provocative. Ma Ying-jeou had been willing to accept the 1992 consensus in the way that Beijing desired. He also then engaged in a sleight of hand as to its content. I won't bore you with the details, but Tsai Ing-wen tried to find ways to reassure leaders in Beijing that she was not the monster that some people in China thought she was, that she wasn't going to move in the direction of Taiwan independence. So during her campaign, she said over and over and over again, I will maintain the status quo. But she did something even more important, and she established a back channel into the Chinese leadership so that there could be exchanges of views about the direction that Tsai was going to take and not take. She understood that Beijing had made public demands as to commitments she should make about her intentions. For some complicated domestic political reasons, she didn't want to do that in the explicit way that Beijing was demanding, but she was willing to do it in a more ambiguous way. And you know as well as I do that Chinese diplomacy is full of ambiguity when it serves the Chinese government's interests. And so she was trying to find formula to meet Beijing's demands. And she actually thought that she had accomplished that. I was in Taiwan at the time of her inauguration. I heard her address where she spoke about the 1992 consensus in a somewhat ambiguous way. She talked about the legal relationship between Taiwan and the mainland in a somewhat ambiguous way. And that evening at the inaugural banquet, her senior officials told me, we think we've cleared this hurdle. We think that we can coexist. They were very relieved. They thought they'd pulled it off. And then something happened. I don't know what it was, but in the end, Beijing decided that maybe it didn't want to coexist with her, and that instead it would be better to try and isolate her, marginalize her, undermine her political position in Taiwan. I think it was a huge missed opportunity. It reflected the politics at the time in Beijing.
What politics in Beijing? That they couldn't accept having any discussions with the DPP that was willing to, mostly embrace the 92 consensus?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that Beijing was demanding two things. First, it was demanding acceptance of the 92 consensus. But second, it was demanding that she speak to what they call the core connotation. And that is Taiwan a part of the state that we call China? That was the KMT's position. It was China's position, obviously. Our position is ambiguous. Well, I think that given the politics within the DPP, there was no way she could have said that explicitly, because there was a faction in the DPP that would have refused to support her in the election. What she did do was to talk in an indirect way. She said, I was elected under the Constitution of the Republic of China, and that's how I'm going to carry out my duties. Well, the Constitution of the ROC is a one China document, and there's an implication that Taiwan's a part of it. She said, we have a law governing the relations between the Taiwan side of the Taiwan Strait and the mainland side, and I will follow that law. And that law implies that the two sides are part of one country.
Right.
So
a lot of that is in we're not going to I have a lot of questions about polling, but I just urge people to go into the book where there's just there's a trove of treasure data relating to various polling in Taiwan. But let's go on to the Biden policies towards Taiwan. You know, inviting the Taiwan representative in the United States, B. Kim, to the inauguration, not completely overturning the Pompeo contact rules for the executive branch, allowing the ambassador to Palau to accompany the president of Palau to Taiwan, having the charge in Tokyo meet with the the head of the Taiwan, or the charge of the Taiwan organization there. Is this policies which you, if you had Biden's ear for 2 minutes, would you say these are good ideas?
The first thing I would say is that we can accomplish a lot with Taiwan. We can have a lot of contacts with Taiwan, but it's not necessarily in our interest to talk publicly about it. And if you do it, but keep it a little bit quiet, you don't create problems for yourself. Second, in one case, I think that the pandemic created a situation that required an exceptional action on our part. This had to do with the inauguration. Usually, there's a delegation that comes from Taiwan, and it may be led by the head of the ruling party. It may be led by the chairman of the legislature. But it's, several people, and one of the people in the delegation is Taiwan's representative to the United States. So B. Kim Xiao's predecessors have attended the inauguration. Well, if you have a pandemic and it screws up travel, and people from Taiwan can't come to the United States for the inauguration, what are you going to do? You're going to have nobody, or are you going to have B. Kim?
Yeah, great explanation. And what about the American ambassador to Palau going to Taiwan?
I have no explanation for that. I cannot explain that. I think that this was something that may have occurred on the initiative of that ambassador without really checking. There was a period after Pompeo's action in December of 2020, where I think there was a lot of uncertainty in the State Department as to what was acceptable and what was not. Since the administration came into office, it did a review of the contact rules, the guidelines by which we conduct our interactions with Taiwan officials. And, I can't talk about the details of it, but I think that people in the department now have a much better sense of what they can and can't do. And maybe these sort of anomalous kinds of actions will not be repeated.
And the same goes for the meeting of the charge and the quote charge in Tokyo, the Taiwan charge in Tokyo.
Well, that's one that I would put under the category sort of do it, but don't put it on Twitter.
Oh, who tweeted it? The Taiwan? Who tweeted it? The Taiwan?
I think it was our guy.
Oh, really?
Charge.
And I assume the Steinberg, Dodd, Armitage trip, since they were former officials, we've done that many times, and that was fun.
Yes, that's right. I have no problem with that. Also, I think it was a good thing because Chris Dodd was involved in Taiwan issues for a long time. Jim Steinberg was deeply involved in Taiwan issues when I was chairman of AIT, and then in the Obama administration. Rich Armitage, longtime friend. Both Rich and Jim are sort of personal friends of Tsai Ing-wen. So if you want to get a channel directly to the Taiwan leader, who better would you ask than these three people?
Last question, because we're out of time. The book ends with a very interesting, upbeat proposal. which is getting the KMT and the DPP together to almost, I wouldn't call it, you don't suggest to communicate, but agree on how to deal with the problems which the book has kind of laid out. Give us like a nutshell summary of what you would suggest that they do.
Well, the problem I'm trying to address is that Taiwan politics is quite divided at a time when it can't afford to be divided, and because the challenges are so great. And so there's a law in the books now that makes it almost impossible for Taiwan and the mainland to negotiate an agreement that bears on their political relationship. Well, I think that maybe that is sending the wrong message to Beijing, and it would be in Taiwan's interest to repeal that. I think that one problem the Taiwan government has is that it doesn't tax people enough, doesn't tax corporations enough. It doesn't have the resources it needs to improve its deterrent and do a lot of other things as well that have nothing to do with cross-strait relations. Politics, I'm sure, gets in the way of raising tax rates. But if the leaders of the two parties sat down together and said, it's in the interest of our people that we tax them more so that we can serve them better, that's the only way it's going to get done. So that's the logic behind it.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's terrific. We have barely touched on what's in this wonderful book, Difficult Choices. I would say, given the prominence of Taiwan now in the US-China relationship, the increased prominence, this is absolutely a must read. As I said, to start this off at a time when there's a lot of heat, this book is full of light. The analysis, the stories, the accuracy are absolutely terrific. And Richard, thanks for writing the book. Thanks for being a friend for these many decades, and thanks for your service.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation, and I'm glad the National Committee is still going strong in spite of all.
Because of all. Thanks.